In this lesson, we'll take a look at one of the regions of the brain known as the cerebrum. So just to kind of give you an idea of the different regions, the cerebrum we're going to do in this lesson, then in subsequent lessons we'll do the diencephalon. Anything that has the name thalamus is located in the diencephalon. So if you see here thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus, they're all located in the diencephalon. Then we'll take a look at the primitive brain, which is the very bottom of the brain. This is this part of the brain that actually keeps us alive. Things like the medulla, right? Medulla oblongata, you may have heard, the pons, and the midbrain. And then we'll finish up by taking a look at the cerebellum. However, in this lesson, we are going to do the cerebrum. So, in order to fit the cerebrum in the cranial cavity, we have to kind of crumple up the brain tissue, and as a result we end up with these outward folds and inward folds. The outward folds are known as a gyrus. If we take a look over here, this is an actual brain. The front of the brain is here, the back of the brain is here. All of these outward folds here, if you kind of follow my cursor, all of these here, these would be known as a gyrus, right? That would be singular, or gyri would be plural. Take a look, just next to the gyrus is an inward fold where the cerebrum folds in. That would be a sulcus. Here you could even see a blood vessel in the sulcus. Right, so our blood vessels will run inside the sulci. That would be plural. Right, so all of these outward folds are gyrus. Here we could actually see this is a section where we cut through the front. Here's a great picture. Here's the upward fold right here. This would be a gyrus, right? And then downward fold like this. This would be a sulcus. A sulcus is a shallow groove. Now, we also are going to differentiate the cerebral cortex from a deeper cerebral white matter. The cerebral cortex, anytime we hear the word cortex, means it's something superficial. Right? The literal translation for cortex, it's a covering. And the covering of the cerebral cortex we're going to see is made up of gray matter. So if you go back to this picture here, again, it's a frontal section through the cerebrum. You can see here this darker tissue. This is going to be gray matter. So everything in here is unmyelinated tissue, like unmyelinated axons, neuroglia, connective tissue, that type of thing. All of this is going to be in this gray matter. And you can see it's not that thick. Deep to the gray matter, you can see obviously this is all white matter. This contains myelinated axons that are, here you can see are going across the brain this way, right? Other myelinated axons are going to go down this way. They run in all different directions. So that would be the deeper white matter, right? So superficial gray matter, known as the cerebral cortex, and the deeper white matter. The last thing on this slide is that our brain is broken up into two halves. They're called cerebral hemispheres. Let's take it up over here. So again, we're looking at the front of the brain cut, but this would be the left side of this brain. This would be the right side of this brain. If you notice right here, there's a deep fissure. We'll talk about this in a moment, called the longitudinal fissure. That's dividing the cerebrum into a left side and a right side. Right? So those are the two cerebral hemispheres. Okay, so those are the definitions I want you to know on this slide. Again, a gyrus, an outward fold. A sulcus is an inward fold. It's a shallow groove. The cerebral cortex is going to be the superficial part of the cerebrum, and it's made up of gray matter. And then deep to the gray matter, the cortex, is the white matter. And then we need to know also that the cerebrum is divided into two halves known as cerebral hemispheres. So the deep groove that separates the left and right cerebral hemispheres, if you want to highlight this, is known as the longitudinal fissure. Now, there's an extension of the dura mater that goes down into the deep groove over here, the longitudinal fissure. That extension is known as the falx cerebri, and it comes all the way down, and it helps to stabilize the brain from kind of sloshing back and forth this way. And it's just a piece of the dura mater, right? The dura mater is, remember, is a meninge that goes over and around the brain and spinal cord. So one of the branches of the dura mater comes down right in here. And we're going to call that the falx cerebri. Here's a picture where you can actually see the tissue right in here known as the falx cerebri. If you saw the lesson on the cerebrospinal fluid, we had talked about this large vein up over here. This is called the superior sagittal sinus. This is where cerebrospinal fluid is going to be reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. And so we actually had talked about this in the previous lesson. So the falx cerebri, we want to give this a little bit of a highlight, again, is that dura mater that goes down into the longitudinal fissure. And you can see some of the big sinuses, right, which are just kind of collecting veins. The superior sagittal sinus is in there, the inferior sagittal sinus, and then another one called the straight sinus. And again, they would all be over here. Superior sagittal sinus, here's the inferior, and then here's the straight. Now, there's another groove that I'd like you to know, right? We saw the longitudinal fissure up over here. Separating the cerebellum here from the cerebrum above, there's a groove that goes across this way. Right? We lose it now, and then we see it on the other side. This is known as the transverse fissure. Right? This is a good picture. You can see it right here. And it kind of separates the cerebellum below from the cerebrum above. Right? This would be the cerebrum above. This little here is the cerebellum. Now, just like the longitudinal fissure had the falx cerebri, which was an extension of the meninges in there, this also has an extension of the meninges going in there. The dura mater goes in there, and that tissue is going to be called the tentorium cerebelli. Tentorium is like a tent, right? It covers the cerebellum. So that's where they came up with that name. Tentorium cerebelli would run right inside over here. Here's a picture of the tentorium cerebelli. So kind of picture the cerebellum would be over here, and then this tissue going in this way right here. This right here would be right over the cerebellum. So now it's kind of keeping the cerebrum from sitting directly on the cerebellum, right? It kind of gives a little bit of support to the cerebrum to keep it up. So let's go back to the note just to make sure we got everything. All right, so we have the longitudinal fissure, separates the left and right cerebral hemispheres. Extending down is going to be the falx cerebri, right? That's the extension of the dura mater. Then we have the transverse fissure, which is the fissure between the cerebrum above and the cerebellum below, and that also has an extension of the dura mater in there known as the tentorium cerebelli. So again, falx cerebri here, tentorium cerebelli there. So we had said before that a sulcus was a shallow groove. There are a few shallow grooves that are named, so I want to just go over those. The first one is really important. Give this one a highlight for sure. This is called the central sulcus. Basically, it's running up the left side of the brain and then it continues down on the right side. And we find it between two lobes. The one lobe is going to be called the frontal lobe, and then the other one is going to be called the parietal lobe. So everything in red here is frontal lobe. Again, this brain is looking to the left. So everything in red is the frontal lobe right here. Everything in blue is the parietal lobe. So if you take a look, running right up, there's a shallow groove. It's a continuous groove. It goes up over here to the top of the brain, and then it would go down on the right side of the brain and look identical. And that is known as the central sulcus. Central sulcus. The central sulcus has a gyrus right anterior to it. You can give this one a highlight too because this is really important. This is known as the precentral gyrus. So in kind of a darker red, this gyrus right here, again, remember we said a gyrus was an outward fold. This is the precentral gyrus. What's interesting about this is where all of our voluntary motor movements originate from. So if you follow my cursor here, it's just me moving my cursor back and forth. For this to move, my finger to move the cursor back and forth, this had to start in this part of my brain right now, right? So all of your voluntary movements begin in the precentral gyrus. We can also call that the primary motor area. Right? So precentral gyrus or the primary motor area. It's both terms are used for that. And as I had there, it's where all the voluntary movements are initiated. On the posterior side, right after the central sulcus, there is another gyrus right here. This is in the darker blue. This is known as the postcentral gyrus. Now, this is more of a sensory gyrus. All the sensations that are coming from your body ultimately end up over here. Right? So if something touches you, if you feel something hot or cold, vibration, pressure, any type of sensation, you're going to perceive it on the postcentral gyrus. So again, this is a more sensory gyrus. Right, so if you want to give this one a highlight, it's important. It's called the postcentral gyrus, and we can also call it the primary sensory area. And again, this is where all our sensory information is perceived that's coming up from the body. Right, so if anybody were to have a stroke in either the precentral gyrus or a stroke affecting the postcentral gyrus, right, the stroke in the precentral gyrus would cause them to have paralysis in certain parts of their body, depending on where the precentral gyrus is damaged. Or if they had a stroke affecting the postcentral gyrus, right, they may not be able to sense things coming up from their body the way they did previously. The second sulcus that we have that's kind of an important one is this one right here that runs right kind of at an angle or obliquely down. This is separating the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe above from this lobe right here known as the temporal lobe. That sulcus is called the lateral sulcus. All right, we'll see in a little bit. If we were to open this up, there's a part of the cerebrum inside there known as the insula, and we'll take a look at that after. Again, there's other sulci that are named, but these are the two that I'd like you to know at this point. Let's take a look now at the lobes of the cerebrum as far as their function. The first one I want to do with you, it's an important one. It's the frontal lobe. This controls higher psychic function. Interestingly enough, our personality comes from here. Planning comes from here, your concentration, and as we just said, all of our voluntary movements, that precentral gyrus, is located on the frontal lobe. So again, all of this here is going to be the precentral gyrus, and then all the other things, again, our personality, planning, concentration, all of that comes from the frontal lobe. The parietal lobe, we could also see, we said before, it has more of a sensory function. So this contains the general sensory area, the postcentral gyrus. And really, just think of the parietal lobe as sensing things from our body. Right? All of this here ultimately is going to work together. But this is that postcentral gyrus where we really specifically can isolate or locate on our body where things are coming from. These are other areas of what we call association areas. They assist the postcentral gyrus. Right? So for me at this point, know that the parietal lobe is a sensory lobe. Okay, so that's the frontal and the parietal. Occipital lobe. Right, so if you remember where the occiput bone is, the occipital lobe is right by the occipital bone, and the main thing here is vision. So this kind of green area back here, this is where we perceive our vision. The temporal lobe is the perception of hearing. So all of this here is going to be for hearing. And then finally, if we were to open up the lateral sulcus right here, there's the temporal lobe below and the parietal and frontal lobes above. If we look deep inside here, this is the insula. And the insula will perceive anything that you taste and then also smell, the sense of smell. Okay, so those are the lobes that I'd like you to know, just a general function of those lobes. There's a few other important areas of the cerebrum. There's something known as the basal ganglia. This is a part of the cerebrum that actually controls some of our voluntary movements. So everything that we do is nice and smooth and coordinated. As you go into a pathology class, you'll actually see sometimes damage to the basal ganglia will cause the individual to have abnormal movements. The last part of the, or kind of an extra part here, or another important area, is the limbic system. This is what we call the emotional brain, and this is where all of our emotions come from. So, when something good happens and you feel joy, or there's grief, that type of thing, any type of emotion that you feel comes from the limbic system. It's more extensive than that. It actually is part of many different areas of the brain. Right? It's partly in the cerebrum, but a lot of other areas of the brain contribute to the limbic system. Okay, so that concludes our lesson on the cerebrum.